History often celebrates the victors. But what happens when the victor is outnumbered, surrounded, and seemingly doomed? Imagine standing in the heart of enemy territory. Ahead of you, 80,000 warriors entrenched in a fortress. Behind you, a relief army of 100,000 more, marching to crush you. Retreat means disgrace, defeat, and certain death. Attacking means suicide. You are the hunter who has just become the hunted. This is not a thought experiment. This is the true story of one man who looked at certain annihilation and refused to accept it. Instead, he turned the trap into his masterpiece. A plan so audacious, so ruthless, and so brilliant that it would echo through history for 2,000 years. This is the story of Julius Caesar at the Siege of Alesia, where a commander, with fewer men and no way out, outsmarted an entire nation and carved his name into legend. The year is 52 BC. For 6 relentless years, Julius Caesar had dragged his legions through the wild and unforgiving lands of Gaul, what we now know as France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland. Town after town fell. Some were crushed in brutal sieges, others bent the knee, swearing loyalty to Rome. Each victory brought Caesar not just territory, but immense personal wealth and power. Back in Rome, this conquest turned him from a politician in debt into a man whose influence could no longer be ignored. But conquest comes at a price. The Gauls were not a single nation, but a patchwork of fiercely independent tribes. They tolerated Roman garrisons, endured their harvests being seized, and their people treated like subjects in their own homeland. For years, resentment simmered beneath the surface. And in 52 BC, that resentment found its spark. That spark was a man named Vercingetorix. Young, charismatic, and ambitious, he was chief of the Arverni tribe. Unlike other Gallic leaders who clung to old rivalries, Vercingetorix saw a larger vision: unity. He understood that only together could the tribes hope to resist the iron discipline of Rome. Through bold diplomacy and sheer force of will, he accomplished the impossible. Rivals who had feuded for generations now stood side by side under his command. From the fields of central Gaul to the forests of the north, war bands gathered, sworn to drive Caesar out once and for all. His strategy was not one of glory in open battle. He knew the Romans were too disciplined, their legions too deadly. Instead, he chose the path of fire. Towns were burned, fields destroyed, villages abandoned. Every scrap of food that might feed the Roman machine was denied to them. It was a strategy as brutal as it was effective. Starve Caesar into retreat. And for a time, it worked. Caesar, far from home, found his supply lines stretched to breaking point. His soldiers marched hungry, weary, and embittered. In the hill town of Gergovia, Caesar suffered a rare and humiliating defeat at the hands of Vercingetorix himself. The news raced across Gaul like wildfire. The invincible legions had bled. Roman pride was wounded, and Gallic spirits soared. One after another, tribes threw in their lot with the rebellion. But Julius Caesar was not a man to be cornered easily. He gathered his legions once more, 10 of them, hardened veterans of countless campaigns, and this time, he brought with him a new weapon. A contingent of fierce Germanic cavalry, warriors renowned for their ferocity and terrifying speed. The stage was set. 2 men, 2 visions, and 2 nations now stood on a collision course that would decide the fate of Gaul. For a moment, it seemed as if Caesar's great gamble in Gaul might collapse. The tribes, emboldened by his defeat at Gergovia, poured their warriors into Vercingetorix's banner. Smoke and fire scarred the countryside as village after village was put to the torch. Every road Caesar marched, every valley he entered was stripped bare. No grain, no cattle, no supplies, nothing but ash and ruin. It was a strategy that gnawed at the Romans with every passing day. They were trained to fight battles, not to chase shadows. Morale sank. Whispers spread through the ranks. Even Caesar's most loyal veterans could feel the weight of exhaustion. But Vercingetorix was not content to bleed the Romans slowly. Flush with confidence, he took a bolder step. he dispatched his cavalry, the pride of the Gallic tribes, to ambush Caesar's columns as they marched. For the first time in years, the hunter had become the hunted. It was a fatal miscalculation. Waiting for them were Caesar's newly acquired Germanic horsemen. Known for their savage charges and merciless pursuit, they smashed into the Gallic cavalry with a fury no one expected. What was meant to be a crushing blow turned instead into a rout. Vercingetorix, shaken, realized his gamble had failed. To continue open battle was suicide, so he made a fateful decision. He would withdraw his entire army, some 80,000 warriors, into the fortified hill town of Alesia. Alesia was no ordinary stronghold. Perched high on a plateau, its cliffs dropped steeply on every side. 2 rivers coiled around its base like natural moats. To the Gauls, it was a fortress blessed by the gods. Within its walls, Vercingetorix believed he could endure any Roman assault. But his plan went further. Before Caesar could tighten the noose, he sent his remaining cavalry racing across Gaul with an urgent message. Gather every warrior, every sword, every spear. Come to Alesia. Together, we will crush the Romans once and for all. The strategy was as daring as it was simple. Vercingetorix would hold Caesar pinned inside Alesia. The relief force, a tide of warriors drawn from every tribe in Gaul, would descend on the Romans from behind. Caesar would be caught between hammer and anvil, obliterated, and his dream of Gaul shattered forever. For Caesar, the situation was almost absurd in its severity. In front of him, 80,000 warriors dug into an impregnable fortress. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a second army, perhaps 100,000 strong, was marching to annihilate him. His own numbers? Barely 50,000. Retreat meant disgrace, defeat, and a long, bloody pursuit. Attacking meant certain disaster. The besieger was about to become the besieged. For most generals, this would have been the end. But Caesar was not most generals. The trap was closing. Caesar stood in the heart of Gaul, with enemies in every direction. 80,000 warriors watched from the walls of Alesia, waiting to strike if he faltered. And beyond the horizon, messengers were summoning a relief army of unimaginable size. Perhaps 100,000 strong, perhaps more. The math was brutal. Caesar had 50,000 legionaries. Even with their discipline, even with their armor and steel, they were a tiny island in a sea of enemies. A straightforward assault on Alesia was madness. The fortress sat high on its plateau, shielded by cliffs and rivers. To storm its walls would be to throw away lives for nothing. But waiting passively was no better. With every day, Gallic reinforcements drew closer. Most men would have seen no way out. But Caesar did not think like most men. Where others saw an impossible trap, he saw an opportunity to engineer the battlefield itself. His solution was as brilliant as it was insane. He would not build one wall, but 2. The first, the circumvallation, would encircle Alesia in an iron ring, sealing Vercingetorix and his 80,000 warriors inside. No food in, no escape out. A slow strangulation. The second, even bolder, was the contravallation, an outer wall, 14 miles long, built to face outward. This one was meant for the relief army that Caesar knew was coming. Together, the 2 walls would form a vast fortress shaped like a donut, with the Romans trapped in the middle. They would be both besiegers and besieged, defenders and attackers, holding against 2 enemies at once. It was a gamble beyond reason. His men would need to become not just soldiers, but engineers, laborers, and architects of survival. Day and night, legionaries swung pickaxes, hewed timber, and dug trenches. But these were no ordinary walls. Caesar turned the land itself into a killing field. First came deep trenches, some flooded with diverted river water, forming moats to slow any charge. Then pits, carefully hidden, each armed with sharpened stakes, ready to impale the unwary. Half-buried logs bristling with iron hooks to tear at feet. fields of sharp wooden spikes to break the momentum of cavalry. And finally, ramparts of earth and timber, 12 feet high, crowned with palisades and watchtowers bristling with Roman artillery. From above, the contraptions looked like layers of a nightmare. Every obstacle designed to shatter formations, drain momentum, and funnel attackers into narrow kill zones where the disciplined legions could strike. Inside the inner ring, the exact same defenses faced Alesia. The Gauls would be caged like animals, watching as the trap was completed around them. It was an achievement so staggering that even Caesar himself, in his own writings, could not resist boasting of it. Modern archaeologists, studying the remains of trenches and wooden stakes, confirm his audacity. In a matter of weeks, he had built a fortress of 2 walls spanning 25 miles in total, one of the greatest feats of military engineering in history. But walls alone could not win the battle. Inside Alesia, food was running out. Vercingetorix, ruthless as ever, forced the civilians, thousands of men, women, and children, out of the gates, hoping Caesar would let them pass. If the Romans allowed them through, his warriors would have more food. If not, perhaps their cries of suffering would rattle Caesar's army. But Caesar was cold. He shut the gates of mercy. The civilians were trapped between city walls and Roman lines, left to starve in no man's land. Their screams and wails filled the nights, a living reminder to the Gallic warriors that no help was coming. It was not only a siege of bodies, but of minds. And still, the clock was ticking. Every day, the relief army drew closer. Every day, the Romans worked themselves to exhaustion, knowing their fortress would soon be tested by fire and steel. When the horizon finally darkened with the dust of tens of thousands of Gallic warriors, the trap was ready. Caesar had set the stage for one of the most desperate battles in ancient history. Late September. From the towers of the outer wall, Roman sentries saw the hills begin to move. Dust rose like a storm on the horizon. Then came the sound drums, horns, and the thunder of countless feet. The Gallic relief army had arrived. Ancient sources claim their numbers were a staggering 250, 0 infantry and 8, 0 cavalry. Modern historians doubt that scale, but even if the truth was closer to 100, 0, it was still a tidal wave compared to Caesar's 50, 0. For the first time, Vercingetorix's gamble seemed within reach. Inside Alesia, his 80, 0 warriors roared with renewed hope, shouting from the walls. Outside, the relief host stretched across the plain in an endless line of spears and shields. Caesar's men stood sandwiched between them, outnumbered 3-1, staring into what should have been certain doom. And then the battle began. The Gallic cavalry led the first charge. They thundered across the plain, hooves shaking the earth, banners streaming behind them. Infantry followed, a wall of shouting warriors crashing toward the outer defenses. At the same time, from within Alesia, Vercingetorix hurled his men against the inner wall. 2 fronts, 1 army. The nightmare had come to life. But Caesar's walls held. The moats and trenches turned cavalry charges into chaos. Pits and spikes broke formations. Warriors tumbled, impaled, trapped, screaming. Those who reached the palisades were showered with javelins, stones, and bolts from Roman artillery. The legions, disciplined and unshaken, fought with ruthless precision. Caesar himself rode along the lines, his crimson cloak blazing against the dust, calling his soldiers by name, urging them to hold. His very presence steadied them. When the Gallic horsemen began to falter, Caesar unleashed his secret weapon. The Germanic cavalry surged from hidden gates, slamming into the disorganized enemy with a fury that shattered them. In moments, what had begun as a terrifying assault dissolved into panic. The first wave had failed, but the Gauls would not stop. That night, under the cover of darkness, they tried again. Warriors crept forward with ladders and grappling hooks. In silence, they crossed the fields of traps, filling trenches with brush, hauling siege equipment up to the walls. Suddenly, Horns blared. Torches flared. A storm of Gallic warriors crashed into the ramparts. It was chaos. Screams and steel filled the night. In several places, the defenders were overwhelmed. Gauls clambered over the walls, hacking and clawing. For a heartbeat, it seemed the Romans might break. But Caesar had planned for this. He had held back reserves legionaries under the command of his most trusted lieutenants, Marcus Antonius and Gaius Trebonius. They rushed to the weakest points, rallying their men, cutting down the attackers in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. Slowly, the breach was sealed. By dawn, the Gauls were driven back, leaving piles of dead beneath the walls. Yet the siege was far from over. The next day, Gallic scouts discovered a weakness. To the north, a large hill had been left outside. Caesar's fortifications, it was too steep, too wide to include within the ring. A Roman camp guarded it, but its defenses were lighter than the rest. Here lay their chance. The Gallic chiefs gathered. They entrusted 60 of their best warriors to a commander named Vercingetorix, cousin of Vercingetorix. He would march under the cover of night, scale the hill, and smash into the Roman camp from the rear. At the same time, the main army would strike the walls again, and Vercingetorix would unleash every man he had from inside Alesia. A triple assault, a final gamble, the hammer and the anvil crashing at once. The fate of Gaul and Rome now rested on the most desperate day of Caesar's life. Dawn broke over Alesia with an ominous silence. Both armies knew what was coming. The fields between the walls were littered with corpses from the night before, but neither side could afford hesitation. Today would decide everything. At midday, the storm began. To the north, Vercingetorix unleashed his 60 chosen warriors. They surged up the great hill, crashing into the lightly defended Roman camp. Shields splintered, towers shook, and for the first time, Roman lines began to buckle. At the same time, the Gallic relief army launched a massive assault on the outer defenses, battering the trenches and palisades with sheer weight of numbers. Horns blared from within Alesia as Vercingetorix threw open his gates. 80,000 warriors poured out, hurling themselves against the inner wall. 3 fronts. One Roman army. Everywhere, the sky turned black with arrows and stones. The ground shook with the tramp of feet, the screams of the dying, and the clash of steel. Caesar's men fought like demons, but even discipline has its limits. On the northern hill, Roman defenders were being overwhelmed. The Gauls swarmed over the ramparts, flooding into the camp. Legionaries fell back in chaos. The line was breaking. Caesar saw it, and in that instant, he made the decision that legends are born from. He donned his scarlet cloak, the unmistakable signal of his presence. With a small escort, he rode straight into the heart of the collapsing line. Amidst the dust and blood, every soldier could see their general standing tall, fearless, sword raised. His very presence was a rallying cry. The legionaries stiffened, their panic turned to fury. They locked shields, pushed back, and the fight roared anew. But still, the sheer weight of Gallic numbers pressed forward. The camp teetered on the edge of annihilation. Then Caesar gambled everything. He ordered his cavalry commander, Titus Labienus, to take several cohorts and ride out of the defenses entirely. Circle wide, strike the Gauls from behind. It was madness. It weakened other parts of the line. If Labienus failed, the Romans would be crushed. But Caesar knew the moment demanded risk. As the northern camp burned with desperate fighting, Roman trumpets suddenly blared from behind the Gallic host. Labienus had arrived. His cavalry smashed into the rear of Vercingetorix's army with devastating force. Panic rippled through the Gauls. What they thought was their victory turned in an instant into their ruin. Caught between the ramparts ahead and cavalry in their rear, the Gallic warriors broke. They fled in chaos, dropping weapons, trampling each other in their desperation to escape. The rout was contagious. Seeing their strongest assault collapse, the relief army faltered. Germanic horsemen, unleashed once more, tore into them with merciless ferocity. Within hours, What had been a sea of warriors dissolved into a storm of fugitives. Inside Alesia, the warriors saw their salvation vanish before their eyes. Their cries of triumph turned to silence. Their last hope was gone. When night fell, the fields were choked with the dead. Tens of thousands of Gallic bodies lay where they had charged, broken against Roman steel and Roman engineering. Caesar had done the impossible. Outnumbered, surrounded, fighting on every side, he had not only survived, he had triumphed. Silence settled over Alesia. For days, the Gauls had roared with defiance, their voices carrying over the fields. Now, only the wind moved through the camps of the dead. The relief army was gone, shattered and scattered. The warriors within the fortress stared down at Caesar's walls and knew the truth: there would be no rescue. Inside, hunger gnawed at their bellies. Supplies were gone. Morale was broken. Vercingetorix, once the spark of rebellion, gathered his war council. He told them plainly, "I fought not for myself, but for the freedom of Gaul. Now that freedom lies in ruins, the time has come to choose." The choice was grim: kill him and try to appease Caesar, or surrender together. They chose surrender. The next day, the gates of Alesia creaked open. In one of the most iconic moments of Roman history, Vercingetorix appeared. Clad in his finest armor, he mounted his horse and rode out alone. He circled the seated Caesar, then dismounted. Without a word, he stripped away his weapons and cast them at his conqueror's feet. The proudest warrior of Gaul bowed his head to Rome. He was taken in chains. For 6 long years he languished in captivity, paraded at last in Caesar's triumph through the streets of Rome before being quietly strangled in a cell. His life ended, but his legend endured as the man who came closest to uniting Gaul against the empire. For the survivors of Alesia, Caesar's judgment was cold but calculated. Each of his legionaries received 1 Gallic captive as a slave, a reward for endurance. Yet the warriors of the strongest tribes were pardoned, a political gesture meant to cement Rome's new rule. The consequences were vast. Gaul's independence, after centuries of resistance, was extinguished. Its people, its culture, its lands all folded into the Roman world. From that moment, Gaul would march not as a free nation, but as a province of empire. For Caesar, Alesia was more than just a victory. It was proof of genius. His engineering had transformed an impossible situation into triumph. His psychology, merciless when needed, inspiring when it mattered, broke enemies and lifted allies. And his tactical flexibility, holding reserves until the perfect moment, turned chaos into opportunity. Alesia secured his future. The wealth of Gaul paid his debts. The loyalty of his battle-hardened legions gave him power beyond politics. Within a few years, he would cross the Rubicon, defy the Senate, and set Rome on the path from republic to empire. The fields of Alesia were more than a battlefield. They were the stage where a commander outnumbered, surrounded, and doomed proved that the sharpest weapon in war is not the sword but the mind that wields it. The Siege of Alesia was more than a clash of armies. It was a masterclass in vision, endurance, and the will of one man to bend fate itself. Julius Caesar did not win because he had more men. He won because he dared to see what others could not. If you found this story of tactical genius fascinating, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Epic History Chronicles for more epic tales from the ancient world. And tell us in the comments, which legendary battle or commander should we uncover next? Hannibal at Cannae, Alexander at Gaugamela, or perhaps the stand of the Spartans at Thermopylae? Your suggestion might shape our next episode. Thank you for watching and for keeping history alive with us.